Hello. It's been a while. I have returned. Kind of, sorta. This is the first video that I'm kind of creating in a very long time. I've been on a bit of a hiatus. I wanted to tell you guys an update on what's going on with my channel, with my live stream, the situation with me, and kind of like where things are headed. A little bit of news to cover. Obviously, there's been some changes to the Shaman quite recently, and some exciting stuff going forward, but I wanted to kind of start things off creating content again with a fun discussion video on the updates for myself, what I've been doing, and a lot to do with the game itself. So first off, I know that some of you guys have also been on the scope of information for the Shaman class changes recently that hit the live servers. Yes, these are out. A lot of people are talking about it. If it is enough of an increase to our single target to really warrant bringing Elemental Shaman into the meta for high Mythic Plus keys. Of course, you can still do relatively good damage and do high enough keys. It's just a matter of, you know, playing with the people that are going to allow you to do that, right? Petco is a really good example of that. And if you guys are looking to get more Elemental Shaman content, either from YouTube or Twitch, I recommend going over to Petco. I guess I'll link his content in the video's description down below. But I wanted to talk about these changes first, and then we'll get into a little bit of extra content afterwards. So Shaman received a pretty decent single target buff to a lot of its abilities. A lot of this does not pertain to PvP though, because they are still really quite strong in arenas and battlegrounds. So lightning bolt damage was increased by 10%. Lava burst damage was increased by 6%, which indirectly actually buffs our AoE with the wildfire build. Earthshock's damage was increased by 6% along with Elemental Blast, because if you're spec'd into that, it, you know, swaps out Earthshock. Ice Fury's base damage has been increased to 80%. Now, this is a damage increase for both PvE and PvP. I've seen some instances where Ice Fury is critting for like above 120k, so that's pretty sweet. Ice Fury causes Frost Shock to generate 14 Maelstrom instead of 8. So this is a pretty substantial increase of 6 Maelstrom per cast. And then Frost Shock's damage is increased by 15%. If you're running the lightning build with Mountains Will Fall, which a lot of people have been kind of talking about, you know, is that going to be the go-to build now? A lot of your damage profile has been increased from these changes, which is quite good. I've been testing it out myself, but I'm sure some of you guys may have already known that I kind of swapped over a lot of my gameplay to Enhancement instead of Elemental. But I'm flopping back and forth, really. I'm flopping back and forth between the two right now, trying to figure out, well, obviously, the pros and cons to each of those kind of specs. Obviously, Enhancement has a bit of more of the spotlight on it currently than I would say Elemental does, but Elemental can be surprisingly competitive if in the right hands. And by in the right hands, I mean like a person that actually knows how to play it very well, controlled CD usage, you know, plays with a group that knows how to play with an Elemental Shaman. But I also wanted to go over kind of my take on the pros and cons of each spec as I've been playing it, playing both of them, and kind of like my expertise with the Elemental Shaman spec over the years, and how it's performing in Dragonflight in comparison to its Enhancement brethren. Also, an update for myself. I had been taking a hiatus for a pretty long time. Now, the reason for that was kind of like the fall of WoW and Warcraft in mid Shadowlands, I'd say. You know, I kind of took a step back from WoW and I was like, okay, maybe I need to pursue something else, a different career at this time. And so I did that. I got a full-time big grown-up job and kind of did that for about a year and a half, and moved actually jobs twice because of a real estate issue. Well, I was in the real estate market for a little bit, but then the real estate economy here in Ontario, Canada, crashed pretty badly mid last year, and so I had to leave that position there, got into a new job, and I identified over several months that this new job was not exactly healthy for me. It caused way too many issues, both with my personal life here with my significant other Steph. My mental health, my physical health was kind of taking a toll as well. And it was, I thought I could make it work for the long time, and I was very stubborn with that. But I kind of, pushed myself forward to ending that job there. So for the time being, I am back creating WoW content. I'm going to be streaming pretty much every day. So if you guys want to head over to twitch.tv/BarackWithShama, the link to my Twitch page will be in this description down below. But let's talk about kind of my thoughts on Enhancement and Elemental, the pros and cons. So I've written everything out, so it's a lot more seamless here. This is just going to be a fun kind of discussion video about what my thoughts are on it. But for Elemental, I believe that the pros are very high, uncapped burst AoE potential and sustained AoE. If I'm over at these training target dummies here in Valdrakken, I can sustain like 215k on these 5 targets over the course of several minutes. And I'm pretty happy with that. And then my burst is like really, really good as well. Obviously, I'm running the wildfire build mainly, but I have been messing around with the lightning Mountains Will Fall build, which in my add-on is called Lightning China. The Lightning China build, and you can kind of swap out Prime Elementalist for Liquid Magma Totem to get more sustained AoE throughout the dungeon. I think is Liquid Magma Totem, but obviously better single target is going to be Prime Elementalist. Side point. There are many flexible builds, and you can kind of play whatever the heck you want. I mean, both in Raid and Mythic Plus, there's a lot of different unique builds that Elemental is kind of able to play. Whereas Enhancement, it's just like if you're not playing the Elemental build in Mythic Plus, you're kind of trolling. The physical build, hey, maybe there's some stuff that I don't know about it, but anything that is very heavily RNG dependent, I find is not going to perform well in Mythic Plus. But Wildfire build is enough sustained damage outside of your Deeply Rooted Elements procs that it's pretty darn good. And when those procs do happen, it's nice. It's nice to go on. Also, there's a low CDR, like low cooldown reduction, high uptime on your cooldowns with Elemental right now. As a caster, which is quite a big difference in comparison to other casters. Like you're pretty much ready to go every big trash pack, as long as you're pooling your Maelstrom properly, you're using your CDs properly, you're lining up your burst windows. Elemental has a lot of really high uptime when it comes to your CDs, but the one thing that it does fall short, I think, when it comes to those damage between packs is those 2 to 3 targets is still a very lacking point when it comes to Elemental. Now it gets a little bit better with the Lightning Mountains Will Fall build with Ice Fury. It gets a little bit better for 2 to 3 target cleave, but it is still a noticeable con for Elemental. Elemental also has way fewer keybinds, I'd say, than Enhancement does. You can get away with half as many, no, maybe not half as many, but maybe 3/4 as many keybinds as Enhancement players have to play to do their normal damage rotation. So that's fantastic. I think Elemental is only about 4 to 5 keybinds for their normal damage rotation, whereas Enhancement is like 6, 7, 8 in some situations, depending on how fast they're generating Maelstrom and how fast Feral Spirits is coming off cooldown. So yeah, way fewer keybinds. It's easier to play, honestly, and it's fun. It is extremely fun to play the Wildfire build. Super high APM, lots of procs that are happening. Your attention. It's fun to play. It's a pretty fun to play spec that's also pretty mobile, and that's only going to get better, I think, for the Shaman class in general in 10.07 when our Shaman tree, talent tree, our main class talent tree actually gets revamped and everything gets moved around. I've taken a look at the PTR for that talent calculator, and it opens up a lot of really great utilities for both an Elemental and Enhancement. I think we have like 3 points to play around with now, instead of going pretty much into mandatory things that we have to, like Healing Stream Totem and Swirling Currents in order to get Ancestral Guidance. That's not a thing anymore in 10.07, so that's fantastic. really good changes to come there. Anyway, moving on for the pros for Elemental. Higher off healing potential, I'd say, than Enhancement, with how much uncapped AoE we're able to do and how much more burst AoE damage we can do. Obviously, that compared to Enhancement, when using something like Ancestral Guidance, Elemental just has a lot more off healing potential, but that also means Elemental has a lot more over healing potential. I mean, if you take a look at the healing breakdown for Ancestral Guidance in a lot of keys, most of the healing is actually over healed instead of healing done to the players itself. Now, if you're using it in very specific situations, like it's part of your group's cooldown rotation for certain boss fights or certain mob pulls, you know, it's going to be used in a bit of a smarter way. So you may not see that as much in better organized groups. But in pug plays, yes, you're going to see the majority of Ancestral Guidance healing being over healing, especially on Elemental. Low cooldowns on, I want to say, like for Elemental, your low cooldowns on your interrupt. You have lots of amazing utility that you share with Enhancement, but Elemental gains the increased utility of interrupts in earthquakes, especially in the Wildfire build. In the Wildfire build, you're spamming so many more earthquakes than in the Lightning Mountains Will Fall build. And it's very important to keep this in mind that because in the Lightning's Mountains Will Fall build, you're running Echoes of Great Sundering. So you're going to be weaving elemental blasts in to empower your earthquakes. And if those earthquakes elemental overload, those earthquakes that are overloaded don't actually knock down, even if you're spec'd into Tumultuous Fissures. So with Wildfire Mythic Plus build, you're spamming so many more earthquakes. They have a 3% higher increased chance to knock down enemies. And in very troubling pulls, like the Ruby Life Pools pull in the beginning, like I've recently been getting up to high enough keys where this pull here in the beginning is a lot of mobs, okay? There are a lot of Earthshapers that have that cast that goes off that does a crap ton of raid damage or party damage. And Earthquake does a fantastic job of interrupting those mobs as well as the casters and the Primal Turret Sentries casting their earthen spikes, which causes a lot of kind of ground effects and obviously can one-shot a lot of players if they're not paying attention. Enhancement, on the other hand, has a lot of AoE controlled interrupts, such as Sundering, Thunderstorm with the knock-up talent, so you could spec into Thunder Shock instead of having your Thunderstorm knock enemies back and knocks enemies up, right? You still have Capacitor Totem, okay? And I play a Torrent, so I have War Stomp as well. So because you're going to be in melee a lot, you have, and in my case, 4 really good AoE stops to kind of control mobs as enhancement shamans. So Elemental doesn't have that luxury. It's kind of RNG when it comes to the interrupts that they have with their earthquakes, but I digress. We have strong utility options with Dispels, Purges, Tremor Totem, Poison Cleansing Totem, and that's just going to get better in 10.07, right? For Enhancement and for Elemental, you have to spec into Cleanse Spirit if you're going to be running Temple of Jade Serpent. That's why they bring you to Temple, right? But you're always pretty much going to have Cleanse Spirit and Purge as an Elemental Shaman because you want to go down the right side of the tree here to get Gust of Wind, Brimming with Life, and if you're playing Wildfire build, obviously you would get Totemic Recall and the talent that reduces its cooldown. So you're pretty much always going to be running this side. Unless you're going to be playing the Lightning build, you can instead obviously want to go to Frost Shock, so you can skip over Cleanse Spirit, right? And then you can take a talent out of Nature's Guardian or Windrush Totem if you don't really need, well, you would kind of need Nature's Guardian, but to go into Cleanse Spirit. I know some people don't play with Nature's Guardian, but let's talk about a con really quick. I know we already talked about one con with 2 to 3 target cleave for Elemental, but Elemental Shaman is noticeably squishier than Enhancement. The self-healing, the self-sustain is just noticeably worse. Now, the reason that is we have to either spam healing surges on ourselves or drop a healing stream totem into a healing surge in order to benefit from swirling currents to increase the effective healing surge by 25%. We have to press essentially 2 buttons. If I need to press Nature's Swiftness in order to get that healing surge off quicker, if I'm going to die, I can do that. But Enhancement Shamans, they can rely so heavily on Maelstrom weapon stacks in order to increase the healing of their healing surge. I have topped myself from 20% HP with a single healing surge as an Enhancement Shaman. That's fantastic self-sustain. If the case does come, obviously you want to spend your Maelstrom on damaging abilities instead of healing, but the self-sustain capabilities for Enhancement is way better than Elemental. So that is a very hard con for Elemental. I find myself having to tell the healer to kind of babysit me a little bit, and that forces you as an Elemental player actually to be a lot more aware of the mechanics in the dungeons, to be able to interrupt pretty much on cooldown, especially if something is targeting you, right? To be a lot more aware of what's happening and to avoid taking as much damage as you can. It forces you to play better. So that's, I don't know if you would call that a con or a pro. I mean, it's a con in my books. But anyway, Elemental is arguably one of the most fun casters or range specs to play in the game right now. As I was talking about before, it's super reactive. It has a high APM, really big numbers, juicy procs that feel good. I have a weak aura that does a gunshot sound every time that Ascendance procs with the Wildfire build. So you guys might see that on the stream, but it's pretty darn fun to play. And I'm starting to learn and enjoy the Lightning build itself as well. So now that we've kind of covered the majority of what I think the positives are, and hey, if I missed some, if you guys think otherwise, there's some stuff in there that I missed, I would highly recommend talking about it. Put in the video's comments down below. But Elemental doesn't have an immunity, and that's a problem, especially because it's so squishy. We talked about that earlier, but Elemental's capabilities for self-sustain and defensives is really limited. You have the option to obviously just sit in Ghost Wolf for up to a 20% damage reduction with Spirit Wolf, right? You have Astral Shift, but you have Earth Elemental, which increases your maximum health, but that's on a 5-minute cooldown. You have Brimming with Life, increases your health by 8%, and obviously we always meme on Shaman saying that, well, Reincarnation is a defensive cooldown, obviously. It doesn't take a battle res, and you know, you get it majority of the time a lot faster in keys now with Brimming with Life. So honestly, in my opinion, I would probably trade Brimming with Life for an immunity. How many times do you think about having an immunity where you would have survived something, instead you had to onk, right? Like, and then you lose a bunch of your buffs. It's just not fun. So immunity lacking is a huge discrepancy. One thing that a lot of Shaman players, Elemental Shaman players specifically, struggle with is positioning of enemies in conjunction with earthquakes while doing damage. And I mean this in the way that tanks kind of position their mobs, right? Obviously, this week is Sanguine Week, for example. So Elemental Shaman has a lot lower value, especially because of the earthquake knockdowns, as you guys can imagine. So I would recommend leading your earthquakes like a sniper would lead his shot on a moving target, leading your earthquakes in the direction that the tank is going to be moving the mobs. That way your earthquake uptime is a lot higher and you're not wasting Maelstrom essentially on earthquakes that mobs are just moving out of. So that's a tip I would say for that. Mythic plus builds, I guess this is a con too. Your Mythic plus builds tend to lean more into an AoE focused talent build, resulting in a kind of like an imbalance for our optimal builds to have both single target and AoE. Now, these single target focused buffs that we just got, that's pretty good, right? It's in the good direction, but I don't think it was enough. I honestly think that Earthshock Elemental Blast should have gotten a little bit of a higher buff. I don't think I'd buff Lava Burst any higher than it was, but Earthshock and Elemental Blast I feel like could have used an additional 4% extra percentage increase on that ability, maybe even Lightning Bolt as well. I just think that it's just not enough to make us competitive in Mythic Plus, especially when our builds focus more around AoE. So in that imbalance is a big con for Elemental Shaman. Obviously, tuning can fix those things, but when you compare it to something like a Balanced Druid, a Shadow Priest, a Frost Mage, their AoE or their Mythic Plus builds have a really good balance of high sustained AoE damage or high burst AoE damage and sustained competitive single target. So that imbalance is kind of a big contingency point for Elemental Shaman and why they're lacking in the kind of play rate that they are. Also, they kind of don't really have any major raid or party buffs. They only bring Bloodlust, right? We talked about Sky Fury Totem being a thing that would have been a nice party buff to bring, or an aura or something, right? And I would imagine if Elemental Shamans could spec into something like Mana Spring Totem, but for a raid buff that increased our party's crit damage or our haste, right? That would be enough to kind of consider Elemental Shaman when it comes to a raid buff or a party buff scenario, especially when building around comps for that. Moving over to Enhancement, I've been playing it a lot more this season than Elemental. And obviously I haven't been able to play as much as I would like to be able to play to master Enhancement as much as I could master Elemental Shaman. But I'm going to give you guys some points on my findings, obviously, and talk about stuff that, I kind of found along the way of playing it at a decently high level. So party buffs for melee is obviously one of them. Wind Fury Totem is a huge one, especially if you're building a melee focused comp like Prot Warrior, Rogue, Outlaw, or Subtlety. A Warrior as well in there, or a Feral Druid or a Monk. Wind Fury Totem is a very useful buff, especially because Prot Warriors gain so much value from it, especially with Rage Generation. So they just bring a party buff. Obviously, you don't have to spec into it if you're not playing kind of like a heavy melee comp. If you're playing with like a couple casters in there, right? I tend to not really spec into it and go more into like a Swirling Maelstrom, Crashing Storms. I would go into Crashing Storms and Crash Lightning, and then go with Swirling Maelstrom as my Mythic Plus build if I'm not using Wind Fury or Wind Fury weapon. I've also seen some Shamans still keep these talents, right? And if they're going into a melee focused build, they would actually get rid of Storm's Wrath and Elemental Blast and go into Wind Fury Totem and Wind Fury weapon. So it's kind of like you have some options here. If you need more sustained single target damage, you can go Elemental Blast. Or 2 to 3 target cleave. That's really good spell for that. And then if you needed that buff for your raid, I would recommend, if you're going to play Wind Fury Totem, to play Wind Fury weapon instead of using a haste rune on your Shaman. But I digress. One thing that Enhancement does that a lot of other classes don't do, and it's not really spiky in its damage profile, it's just high consistent damage. And this makes its damage profile also very versatile. A point that I'd like to add for one of its pros is it can choose within the same rotation to funnel its damage or to do as much AoE as the class is capable of doing. And this is kind of in the sense of your Lashing Flames debuff, right? You can use the extra flame shocks you have, especially when a hot hands proc happens, to funnel your damage. You can also choose to, instead of using Chain Lightnings in an AoE situation, you can use Elemental Blasts or Lightning Bolts to funnel your damage. So using the same, almost the same rotation, I really would like to get a Hot Hands proc here, but using almost the same rotation, you can get a lot of really great funnel damage. It's one of the best classes when it comes to that. I know Feral Druid is kind of plays in a similar situation as well. You get a whole bunch of rip dots on targets, and then you kind of want to proc your Ferocious Bite. So it kind of works in the same way as Feral Druid, but it's a little bit better, I'd say, than Feral Druid when it comes to funneling its damage. So that is a huge strength that Enhancement Shaman has over Elemental, I'd say. Not to mention its damage profile is very versatile. It's if you looked at a breakdown of kind of like a Shaman's damage over the course of the entire key, Frost Shock is going to be very high, obviously, because it's one of our strongest AoE abilities. Unfortunately, a con to that is that we are target capped to 5 to 6 targets. So we can only do so much AoE damage. We're limited in that factor. The only uncapped AoE that we have is Crashing Storms, I'd say, and Sundering, right? Which hey, I've seen Sundering do a crap ton of damage, especially with a huge mob stack, but we kind of usually save Sundering outside of our opening rotation for those moments where we need to line up important CDs and stops on an AoE situation for mobs to not cast certain abilities. So yes, it does have a con in that, I'd say. It has a huge high APM or actions per minute, which could be considered a good thing to keep players engaged, but it also could be considered a bad thing when it comes to the difficulty of the spec. Now, in today's Mythic Plus, we have quite a lot of, I'd say, distractions in keys, where you're not always able to play as optimally as you would like to when it comes to spreading your Lashing Flames dots, right? That requires a lot of attention, a lot of really good UI setup as well to be able to see certain things while mob mechanics are going on, and you're kind of making sure that stops are happening on important casts. So being able to maintain and spread your Lashing Flames buffs while everything else is going on in dungeons, and especially in this season, that is a common complaint actually, is that there's just so much noise in today's seasons with all the new dungeons, especially with Azure Vaults and Nakud Offensive. Like, there's just so much going on in those dungeons, important mechanics that needed to be dealt with while you're trying to maintain your most optimal. It's a lot to deal with. So yes, it has a high APM, but that also means it has a high skill ceiling. Hopefully in 10.1, they kind of like cut back on a lot of the mechanics in Mythic Plus. I think I've heard some rumors that they're going to be doing that. So hopefully that'll make things a lot easier for us Enhancement Shaman players. So that's great. I talked a lot about Enhancement cons already, but I think one of the biggest ones obviously is the target cap of 6 targets, limiting AoE scaling. So in comparison to other classes like Warrior, Feral Druid, Demon Hunter, right? Monk in a lot of cases as well, and Outlaw Rogue, obviously Outlaw and Subtlety, their AoE potential is just going to be so much higher than ours, right? But we do gain the added benefit of being able to bring a damage profile of that funnel style damage, which is really, really good. So in comparison, Enhancement Shaman does also, if we're talking about comparing it to other classes, it has limited defensives, right? It kind of goes in that same crutch that Elemental has, except it just has a little bit better self-sustain. Now, in a perfect kind of situation, I have Nature's Guardian, I have Elemental Warding, I have the extra leech from Ancestral Defense, right? I can use Earth Elemental, but the only real and true defensive that I have is Astral Shift. A lot of people over the years have been asking for Shaman to be able to have, or for Blizzard to bring back, Shamanistic Rage, which was a usable defensive, especially in PvP, for just an extra 25 to 30%, 20 to 30% damage reduction, a DR, right? And it could be used while stunned, which made it very good. Back in classic days, Shamanistic Rage helped with your mana regen. Obviously, that's not really a problem anymore, but there was a use for it back then, right? And we've lost that over the years. If Shaman had that again, or a version of that where it's a very short cooldown, just a simple 20%, 20 to 25, maybe 30% damage reduction, maybe on a 1 minute cooldown or a 45-second cooldown, and reduce that damage, that DR down to like 15 to 20%. I think that would make up a lot of what Shaman is lacking when it comes to the survivability portion of things. But you never know. Something could happen in 10.1 where they revamp a whole lot of classes. Maybe they recognize that and bring something back. So one other thing I'd say is a con for Enhancement Shaman, especially if you're an Elemental player thinking of playing Enhancement, is that you're melee. Melee is significantly harder, I'd say, than ranged. You just have to pay attention to so many more mechanics, so much more of what's going on in the dungeon, things that you've never had to deal with. And I have huge respect for really good melee players, because it was a huge learning curve for me transitioning from range as an Elemental player to melee and having to deal with stuff that I never had to deal with before, like Fervent Strikes or Frontals that'll one-shot you, like in Halls of Valor. Those freaking Fatal Strikes or whatever the hell they're called from the Shield Maidens, right? Like a whole bunch of new stuff that I've never had to deal with before. It was a huge learning curve for me. Obviously, the fix to that is just playing it as much as you can to understand those mechanics. So it will take a little bit of time to get used to it. But other than that, again, if I missed anything that you guys think is a pro or a con for either of the specs, write it down in the comment section down below. And I hope to see you again in the near future. I'm going to be putting out a lot more content as the days go by. And I'm going to be streaming, like I said, every day on twitch.tv/BarakRoShaman. So come check out my Twitch channel. We're going to be doing high Mythic Plus content. And I have a lot more time on my hands right now to be able to push pretty significant keys, both as Elemental and Enhancement. So it's an exciting time. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, guys, keep calm and Maelstrom on. Bye-bye.